My landlord called me at midnight with a voice so shaky I barely recognized him. He said, "Get out now. They found the body." I asked what body he was talking about. He said 3 words that made my skin crawl. "In your walls." 10 minutes later, forensic teams in white suits surrounded my apartment building, and I learned I'd been living inches away from a murder victim for 6 months. My name is Harper Green. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic designer from home. The man who called me that night was Mr. Vincent Chen, my 67-year-old landlord who owned the small apartment building where I lived. He'd always seemed like a kind, quiet man. My best friend Tessa is 29 and works as a nurse. She's been my voice of reason since college. My younger sister Paige is 24 and in graduate school. Detective Brian Cole was the homicide detective who walked me through the nightmare. The victim hidden in my walls was Vanessa Ortiz, a 22-year-old college student who'd been missing for 18 months. If you want to hear how I survived discovering my home was hiding a terrible secret, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because this story will make you look at every wall in your house differently. I work from home designing logos and websites for small businesses. 6 months before everything happened, I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of an older building in Baltimore. My previous living situation with roommates had fallen apart, and I needed a place fast. This apartment was surprisingly affordable for the neighborhood, which I thought was just luck. The building was old, built sometime in the 1920s, but it had character with original hardwood floors, high ceilings, and thick plaster walls. Mr. Chen owned the whole building, just 6 units total, and he lived on the 1st floor. He handled all the maintenance himself, even though he was in his late 60s. I rarely saw my neighbors except for Mrs. Ruth Brennan, a 73-year-old woman who lived on the 3rd floor and had been there for 40 years. She knew everything about everyone in the building. I loved living alone after years of dealing with roommates. My best friend Tessa thought I was too isolated, spending entire days in my apartment without seeing another person. My sister Paige worried that I worked too much and didn't go out enough, but I was happy with my quiet routine. I'd work at my desk during the day, make dinner in my small kitchen, watch TV on my couch at night. It felt safe and comfortable and entirely mine. Mr. Chen was a great landlord who responded quickly whenever something needed fixing. The rent was reasonable. The neighborhood was safe. I thought I'd gotten incredibly lucky finding this place. Over the 6 months I lived there, I did notice some odd things, but I never thought they were serious. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear strange sounds coming from inside the walls. It sounded like scratching or settling, like the old building was just shifting. I figured it was old pipes or maybe mice in the walls, which is common in buildings this age. There was also this smell in my bedroom that would come and go. It was musty and unpleasant, kind of like mildew or old building materials. I bought air fresheners and candles and just dealt with it. I thought maybe there was mold somewhere in the old plaster. About 3 months after I moved in, I noticed a small crack appearing in the wall near my bedroom closet. It was barely noticeable at first, just a thin line in the paint. I mentioned it to Mr. Chen one day when I ran into him in the hallway. He said he'd take a look at it, but he seemed nervous when I brought it up and quickly changed the subject. I thought that was a little weird, but didn't push it. Over the next few months, that crack got slowly bigger. 2 weeks before everything happened, it had grown to maybe 4 inches long and a 1/4 inch wide. I could see darkness behind it when I looked closely, like there was hollow space in the wall. That seemed strange, because I thought the walls were solid plaster all the way through. I put a picture frame over the crack to hide it, and made a mental note to push Mr. Chen harder about fixing it. But I was busy with work, and it wasn't urgent, so I kept putting it off. The night my life changed forever started completely normal. It was a Thursday in late October. I'd worked all day on a logo design for a client, taken a break to make pasta for dinner, and spent the evening watching a show on Netflix. Around 9 at night, I video chatted with Paige about her upcoming thesis defense. She was stressed, and I tried to give her advice and encouragement. Around 11, I got ready for bed, did my normal routine of washing my face and brushing my teeth, and climbed into bed. I'm a light sleeper, so I usually fall asleep fast once I'm tired. That night, I was out by 11:30. When my phone rang at exactly midnight, it woke me up immediately. I grabbed it off my nightstand and saw it was Mr. Chen calling. In the entire 6 months I'd lived there, he'd never called me. He only ever sent text messages about maintenance issues or rent reminders. A phone call at midnight was completely out of character. I answered and heard his voice, and it sounded wrong. He sounded terrified. Mr. Chen said my name, and his voice was shaking so badly I almost didn't recognize it. He said I needed to get out of my apartment right now, immediately, without asking questions. My brain was still foggy from sleep, and I asked if there was a fire or a gas leak or something wrong with the building. He took a shaky breath and said something that made my blood go cold. He said they found the body and the police were coming. I sat straight up in bed and asked what body he was talking about. There was this long, horrible pause, and then he said, in barely a whisper, that there was a body in my walls, that the police had found it, and that I needed to leave right now. Then he hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat there in my dark bedroom holding my phone and trying to understand if that conversation had actually just happened or if I was having some kind of nightmare. I looked around my room at the familiar shadows and shapes. Everything looked normal, but my heart was pounding and my hands were shaking. I turned on every light in my apartment and stood in the middle of my living room trying to decide what to do. I called Mr. Chen back immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried 2 more times with the same result. I started looking at my walls differently, like they were suddenly threatening instead of protective. I walked into my bedroom and stared at the crack near my closet that I'd covered with a picture frame. I slowly removed the frame and looked at the crack more closely than I ever had before. It was maybe 4 inches long and wide enough that I could see darkness behind it, but nothing else. I felt this wave of nausea hit me. What did he mean there was a body in my walls? How was that even possible? My walls were solid plaster. They were thick and old. How could there be anything inside them? I grabbed my phone and called Tessa even though it was past midnight. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding half asleep and annoyed. I told her everything about Mr. Chen's call, and she woke up fast. She said I needed to call the police myself right now instead of waiting to see if they showed up. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what was happening, but I knew it sounded insane. I told her my landlord had just called saying police were coming to my building because a body had been found in the walls of my apartment. The dispatcher went quiet for a few seconds, and I could hear her typing. Then she asked for my address. When I gave it to her, she confirmed that units were already being dispatched to that location. She told me to please exit the building immediately and wait outside for officers to arrive. She said not to touch anything and to stay on the line with her. That's when it really hit me that this was actually happening. This wasn't a prank or a misunderstanding. Something terrible had been discovered in my home, and I'd been living with it for 6 months without knowing. I grabbed jeans and pulled them on over my pajama pants. I threw on a sweatshirt and shoved my feet into sneakers without bothering to tie them. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my purse, and left my apartment. The hallway was dark and completely silent. I went down to the 1st floor and knocked hard on Mr. Chen's door. I could see light coming from under his door, but he wouldn't answer no matter how many times I knocked. I called his name and begged him to open the door and explain what was happening. Nothing. I gave up and went outside to the front of the building. It was a cold October night, and I hadn't grabbed a jacket. I stood on the sidewalk hugging myself and staring at my building like I'd never seen it before. Within 3 minutes, I saw flashing lights coming down the street. 2 police cars pulled up fast, followed by an unmarked sedan. Officers got out and immediately approached me asking if I was Harper Green from apartment 2C. I said yes, and they asked me to step further away from the building. More cars kept arriving. A man in plain clothes got out of the unmarked car and walked over to me. He showed me his badge and introduced himself as Detective Brian Cole from the Homicide Division. Homicide. That word made everything feel more real and more horrible. Detective Cole asked me to explain exactly what I knew. I told him about the midnight call from Mr. Chen, about what he'd said, about the crack in my bedroom wall. Cole's face was grim and serious. He asked how long I'd lived in the apartment. 6 months, I told him. He asked if I'd noticed anything unusual during that time. I mentioned the weird smell that came and went, the scratching sounds in the walls at night, the crack that had been slowly growing. He wrote everything down. Then he asked if I'd ever met the previous tenant, or if Mr. Chen had mentioned anyone living there before me. I said no. Mr. Chen told me the apartment had been empty for over a year before I moved in, and that's why he'd done some renovations. Detective Cole nodded slowly, like that information meant something important. More vehicles kept arriving, including a large white van. People in white protective suits started getting out and unloading equipment. Detective Cole explained that they'd received an anonymous tip earlier that evening about possible human remains concealed somewhere in the building. They'd gotten an emergency search warrant, and Mr. Chen had let them in to investigate. Using some kind of thermal imaging equipment, they'd found what appeared to be human remains inside a wall cavity in my bedroom. Detective Cole said they needed to access my apartment immediately to confirm what they'd found and begin processing what was now officially a crime scene. He asked if I had somewhere I could stay for the night, because I wouldn't be able to go back inside for at least several hours, possibly days. I stood there freezing on the sidewalk trying to process what he was telling me. There were human remains in my bedroom wall. I'd been sleeping in that room for 6 months. I'd been living my entire life just inches away from someone who was dead. I felt like I might throw up or pass out or both. I called Tessa back with shaking hands and asked if I could come stay with her even though it was after midnight. She said yes immediately and asked if I needed her to come pick me up. I said no. I had my car. I just needed to get away from this building as fast as possible. Detective Cole said he'd need to speak with me more in the morning, but for now I should go somewhere safe and try to get some rest. Rest seemed impossible, but I nodded. Before I could leave, Mrs. Brennan from the 3rd floor came outside, wrapped in a bathrobe with her gray hair in curlers. She demanded to know what all the police were doing at her building in the middle of the night. I didn't know what to say, but Detective Cole stepped in and explained that human remains had been discovered in the building, and they were investigating. Mrs. Brennan's face went completely white. She grabbed my arm and said something that made everyone stop talking. She said that about 18 months ago, there had been a young woman living in my apartment, Unit 2C. Her name was Vanessa, and she was a college student, very quiet and sweet. Mrs. Brennan said Vanessa had been dating Mr. Chen's nephew Marcus, who used to visit the building all the time. Then one day, Vanessa just disappeared. Mr. Chen told everyone she'd broken her lease and moved out suddenly without notice. But Mrs. Brennan always thought it was strange, because Vanessa had left all her furniture and belongings behind and never came back for any of it. Detective Cole's entire demeanor changed. He pulled out his phone and made several calls right there on the sidewalk. He asked Mrs. Brennan to stay and give a formal statement to officers. He asked me if Mr. Chen had ever mentioned this previous tenant or his nephew. I said absolutely not. He'd told me the apartment had been vacant for over a year. Detective Cole walked over to Mr. Chen's door with 2 other officers. They knocked loudly and announced that they needed to speak with Vincent Chen immediately, and that he needed to open the door. After about 30 seconds, the door finally opened. Mr. Chen looked like he'd aged a decade in the past hour. His face was pale and his eyes were red like he'd been crying. Officers asked him to step outside. He came out slowly and Detective Cole began questioning him right there in front of the building. I could hear pieces of what he was saying. He kept repeating that he didn't know what to do, that it was his nephew, that Marcus had called him in a panic. Detective Cole asked him directly if he'd helped conceal a body in the building. Mr. Chen started crying and nodding. He said Marcus had called him 18 months ago saying there'd been a terrible accident, that Vanessa was dead. Marcus begged his uncle to help him. Mr. Chen said they'd put her body in an old cavity in the wall that existed from when the building was originally constructed, then sealed it up with new drywall and paint. He said he thought about it every single day. He'd kept the apartment empty for a year because he couldn't stand the thought of someone living there, but then he'd run into financial problems and had to rent it out. He said he'd convinced himself no one would ever find out. I listened to this confession in complete shock. Mr. Chen had seemed like such a kind old man, He'd been so nice to me when I moved in, so helpful with small repairs and questions. And the entire time he'd known there was a dead woman sealed inside my bedroom wall. He'd let me live there knowing what I was sleeping next to. Detective Cole arrested him right there, handcuffing him while reading him his rights. Mr. Chen didn't resist. He just kept crying and apologizing to no one in particular. I got in my car and drove to Tessa's apartment in a complete daze. I barely remember the drive even though it was only 15 minutes. When I got there, Tessa was waiting up. She made me tea, wrapped me in a blanket on her couch, and didn't bombard me with questions. She just sat with me. Around 3 in the morning, Detective Cole called my phone. He said forensic investigators had confirmed the remains were human and appeared to be those of a young female. They'd made a preliminary identification based on dental records. The victim was Vanessa Ortiz, a 22-year-old nursing student who'd been reported missing by her family 18 months ago. Her case had gone cold with no leads until tonight. Cole said my apartment was now an active crime scene, and I wouldn't be able to return for at least several days while they processed everything. He also warned me to prepare for media attention once the story broke, because discoveries like this always made the news. I thanked him and hung up. I looked at Tessa and said I could never go back to that apartment. Not ever. She said I didn't have to, that I could stay with her as long as I needed. I barely slept that night, and when I did, I had nightmares about walls closing in and smells I couldn't escape. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Every local news station had the same headline: "Body found concealed in Baltimore apartment wall for 18 months." My building was completely surrounded by news vans and reporters standing on the sidewalk doing live broadcasts. My phone started ringing non-stop with calls from journalists asking for interviews and comments. I ignored every single one of them. I couldn't talk about it. I could barely even think about it without feeling sick. Paige showed up at Tessa's apartment that afternoon, looking terrified for me. My parents called from Florida, where they'd retired, and said they were booking flights to come help me through this. I told them not to come, that I was fine, even though I clearly wasn't fine at all. I couldn't eat anything without feeling nauseous. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crack in the wall and imagined what had been behind it all those months. Tessa ended up taking several days off work to stay with me because I wasn't functioning well enough to be alone. Over the next few days, Detective Cole kept calling with updates. I think he understood that I needed information to process what I'd been living with. He told me that Vanessa Ortiz had been a nursing student at the local community college with dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. She'd been dating Marcus Chen for about 4 months before she died. Neighbors from the building reported hearing them fight frequently and loudly. The night Vanessa died, multiple people heard screaming and crashing sounds coming from Unit 2C around 10 at night. Then everything went silent. Marcus had called his uncle in a panic around 11. Mr. Chen's phone records confirmed the call. Marcus claimed that Vanessa had attacked him during an argument and he'd pushed her away in self-defense. She'd fallen and hit her head on the corner of a table. He said it was an accident, but he'd panicked. Instead of calling 911, he'd called his uncle for help. Together, they'd hidden her body in the wall cavity, sealed it with drywall, and painted over it. Mr. Chen had then reported to other tenants that Vanessa had broken her lease and moved out. When Vanessa's family filed a missing person report, the police investigated but found no evidence of foul play and the trail went cold. A week after the discovery, I got a phone call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was a woman who introduced herself as Carmen Ortiz, Vanessa's mother. She said Detective Cole had given her my number, and she wanted to talk to me if I was willing. My first instinct was to say no, because I didn't know what I could possibly say to this woman, but I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near Tessa's apartment. Carmen was a woman in her 50s, with the same dark eyes and hair that Vanessa had in the photos I'd seen on the news. She thanked me for meeting her, and said she knew this must be difficult for me too. She told me she'd spent 18 months not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead, wondering every single day if Vanessa had run away or been kidnapped or was being held somewhere. She said finding out Vanessa was dead was the worst news she'd ever received. But at least now she had answers. At least she could bury her daughter properly and say goodbye. Carmen said she didn't blame me for anything because I'd been a victim too in a different way. She asked me to tell her about the apartment, about what Vanessa's last space had looked like. I described it as honestly as I could, leaving out the parts about the smell and the sounds that I now understood had been coming from decomposition. After meeting Carmen, I knew with absolute certainty that I could never go back to that apartment. Detective Cole called a few days later to say the forensic team had finished processing the scene and I could retrieve my belongings. I asked Tessa and Paige to come with me because I couldn't face it alone. Walking back into that building felt surreal and wrong. Yellow crime scene tape was still stretched across my doorway. Inside, my apartment looked violated. Everything was covered in black fingerprint powder. My bedroom wall had been completely torn open, revealing the cavity where Vanessa's body had been hidden. I could see the old construction behind the plaster. The space that had been there since the building was first built in the 1920s. I grabbed my clothes, my laptop, some personal items, and told my sisters I was ready to leave. I never wanted to see that place again. I called Mr. Chen's daughter, who was now managing the building, and told her I was breaking my lease effective immediately and wouldn't be returning. She said she completely understood and that I wouldn't owe any remaining rent and would get my full security deposit back. Her father's actions had destroyed lives, and she was horrified by what he'd done. Marcus Chen was arrested in California, where he'd been living under his mother's maiden name. He was extradited back to Maryland to face charges of second-degree murder, along with multiple other felonies. Marcus Chen's trial began 11 months after Vanessa's body was discovered. I was called as a witness, even though I didn't have much to offer beyond testimony about the condition of the apartment and the growing crack in the wall that had led to everything unraveling. The prosecution built their case on forensic evidence, Mr. Chen's detailed confession about helping hide the body, and testimony from neighbors who'd heard the violent fight the night Vanessa died. Marcus took the stand and claimed it had all been a tragic accident, that Vanessa had attacked him first during an argument, and he'd only pushed her away in self-defense. But the medical examiner's testimony destroyed that defense. She explained that Vanessa's skull fractures and injuries were completely inconsistent with a simple fall. She'd been struck multiple times with significant force. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Marcus Chen was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. He showed no emotion when the sentence was read. Vincent Chen, who'd helped conceal the crime, received 12 years for being an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. During his sentencing hearing, he read a statement apologizing to the Ortiz family. He said he'd made the worst decision of his life when he chose to help his nephew instead of calling the police. He said he thought about Vanessa every single day and would carry the guilt for the rest of his life. He sold the apartment building to pay for legal fees and restitution to Vanessa's family. The building itself became locally infamous after the story broke. The new owners tried renovating and renting out the units, but no one wanted to live in a place where a murder had been hidden for 18 months. Eventually, it was sold again to developers who announced plans to demolish it and build new condos. When I heard that news, I felt nothing but relief. That building deserved to be erased. Before the demolition happened, Carmen reached out and asked if I would go with her to visit Vanessa's apartment one final time. I didn't want to go back, but I said yes, because it felt like the right thing to do. We stood together in that empty unit with its torn open wall exposing the cavity where her daughter had been hidden. Carmen said a prayer in Spanish and cried quietly. I cried too. She thanked me again for being part of bringing Vanessa home to her family. It was one of the hardest and most meaningful moments of my life, standing in that violated space with a mother who'd lost everything. It took me a long time to feel normal again. I stayed with Tessa for 3 weeks while searching for a new apartment. I couldn't bring myself to look at any older buildings. I eventually found a place in a modern complex that had been built just 5 years earlier, with thin drywall and absolutely no history. It was more expensive, but I needed to feel safe. Paige and Tessa helped me move in and set everything up. But even in my new apartment, I struggled. I became obsessed with checking the walls, tapping on them to make sure they were solid, convinced there must be hidden spaces or terrible secrets. I started having panic attacks when I was alone. Tessa finally convinced me to see a therapist who specialized in trauma. It took months of weekly sessions before I could sleep through the night without nightmares. My therapist explained that I was experiencing a form of PTSD from the violation of my safe space combined with the horror of what I'd discovered. She said healing would take time, but was absolutely possible. A year after Vanessa's body was found, Carmen organized a memorial service on the anniversary of her death. She asked if I would attend and maybe say a few words. I was terrified, but I agreed. At the service, surrounded by Vanessa's family and friends who'd loved her, I spoke about how her presence had haunted my apartment in ways I hadn't understood at the time. I talked about the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, and about never forgetting victims of violence. After the service, Vanessa's younger brother hugged me and thanked me for caring enough to be there. He said his family had finally been able to start healing once they knew what happened to his sister, and I'd been part of that journey whether I wanted to be or not. Carmen and I have stayed in touch. She sends me a card every year on the anniversary of the discovery, which she calls the day Vanessa came home. I've attended every memorial service since that first one. I'm 30 years old now, 2 years after that midnight phone call changed everything. I still live in that modern apartment with the documented history and thin walls. I still check the walls sometimes, but not as obsessively as I used to. Therapy helped me learn to manage the anxiety and the intrusive thoughts. I still work as a freelance graphic designer, but now I make sure to leave my apartment regularly and stay connected with friends and family. Tessa jokes that the whole experience actually made me more social, which is probably true. Paige graduated with her master's degree, and we're closer than we've ever been. Trauma shows you who your real support system is. After my story became public, several people reached out who'd gone through similar experiences. People who'd discovered their homes had dark histories, or learned they'd been living near crime scenes. There's a specific violation that comes from having your safe space corrupted by knowledge you can't unknow. I started a small online support group for people dealing with this type of trauma. We help each other navigate the complicated feelings that come with these discoveries. Living through this taught me that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces in the most ordinary places. Mr. Chen seemed like a harmless, kind old man, but he helped conceal a murder for 18 months and then rented me that apartment, knowing what was in the walls. I learned that your instincts often know things before your mind catches up. Those smells, those sounds, that persistent feeling that something was wrong, those were all real signals I should have investigated more seriously. I learned you can survive knowing something you can never unknow. For months, I wished I could go back to ignorance. But now I understand Vanessa deserved to be found and her family deserved answers. I think about Vanessa more than I probably should. I never met her, but I feel permanently connected to her. I lived in her space, walked her floors, existed in the place where her life ended. Carmen says I was one of the last people close to Vanessa, and in a horrible way, that's true. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like something was wrong in your home, trust that feeling. Investigate it. Ask questions. Our instincts exist for a reason, and if you've experienced trauma related to your living space, you're not alone, and your feelings are valid. Hit that subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. If my story helps one person trust their instincts or feel less alone, then maybe some good came from the worst experience of my life. Remember that walls have histories and buildings have secrets, and sometimes the most horrifying discoveries happen in places we thought were safe.